Our scripture lesson today is taken from the book of Acts, chapter 9, verses 36 through 43. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. Well, it seems like every movie, every show that they're doing these days seems to be like a remake or of something that had been done before. Now, one of my favorites going way back was West Side Story, which everyone, remembers was essentially, inspired by sort of a remake of Romeo and Juliet. So I really enjoyed, West Side Story. The movie was great, show's great. And I also really enjoyed the Zeffirelli Romeo and Juliet with Olivia Hussey. I don't know how many of you saw that, but I remember in high school, they took us on a field trip to go see it, and they had to get all these parental permission forms for us because there's a bare buttock that appears. Okay? And so we had to get permission for that. But just because, West Side Story is based on Romeo and Juliet, it doesn't mean that these are the same story, right? When we hear these similar stories, we need to focus on the differences. We need to take a look at what's different between them. For example, West Side Story introduces issues that Romeo and Juliet didn't have. For example, a big theme in West Side Story was the racism being experienced by Puerto Ricans in New York City. Okay, so that's a huge factor in the story. Another really important subtext in those stories was that the dialogue in Romeo and Juliet sort of suggests that what happens to Romeo and Juliet is a matter of fate. It's a matter of their destiny, that what's going to happen is what happens. Whereas in West Side Story, there's a much stronger suggestion that what they face is a choice. There are choices that they can make that would dictate their future. Now, we're going to look at this story from Acts 9 that is our text for the day, but we're also going to look at it alongside, just for the moment, with an earlier story in Luke chapter 8. The reason why I'm choosing the story from Luke chapter 8, which is the story of the healing of Jairus' daughter, a synagogue leader's daughter, which appears in the other synoptic gospels as well. The reason I'm choosing the Luke version is because Luke and Acts are regarded to have been written by the same person. Okay, the introduction to both books suggests that it's the same person, and most scholars regard Luke and Acts to be basically a 2-volume work, and they'll often refer to it as Luke Acts, because it's volume 1, volume 2. So we look at this, and so many similar things happen. So we're going to start by looking at the similarities. So both involve a person who falls ill and dies. A woman, in one case, a woman. In the Luke case, a young daughter who becomes ill and she dies. And then what happens next is, of course, everyone is weeping. So in Acts, all the widows stood beside Peter weeping, and in Luke, they were all weeping and wailing for her. And so you have all this weeping that happens in this story. The people are feeling hopeless. Another similarity between them is the bystanders are asked to leave. Okay, so in Acts 9, Peter takes all the bystanders and puts them outside. And then when Jesus came to the house of Jairus' daughter, he did not allow anyone to enter with him, although he actually did bring in his inner circle of disciples. Okay, we've mentioned this before, that Jesus has his followers, and then he's got the 12, and then within the 12, he's got like an executive committee. Okay, so like Peter, James, and John get to come in with him inside. And then, at the end, they say something very similar. All right, in Acts 9, Peter says, "Tabitha, get up." And in Luke 8, it says, "Child, get up." And in one of the gospel versions, in Mark's version, he recites the Aramaic, which is Talitha. Okay, so Talitha in Aramaic means little girl, and then it rhymes with Tabitha, which is an Aramaic word actually for a doe or a gazelle. All right, and so they're similar sounding words. So you have Tabitha, get up, Talitha, get up. So these stories are basically the same in terms of structure and critical things that happen. And the sameness of these stories is important in thinking about the critical difference between these stories. And the critical difference is simply that it's Peter, not Jesus. All right? This is what makes this story so important. We are so used to hearing about Jesus' miracles. We are so used to hearing the stories of what Jesus does. He heals, he heals, he heals, and he does it every which way. There's no consistency necessarily to his methodology. Sometimes he just speaks a word, sometimes he touches the person. But the thing about these two stories is they are so similar in the structure, but it is Peter doing it. We're so used to Jesus' miracles that we can sometimes forget that after Easter, the disciples continued to do them. See, we so often think about Jesus in terms of what he taught us to do. We think about Jesus' teachings. But the lesson of this story is that Peter doesn't just do what Jesus taught. Peter does what Jesus did. You see, we can pay so much attention to learning from Jesus' teachings that we can neglect the call to actually emulate Jesus. And we're called to emulate Jesus. We're told that we will do the things Jesus can do because Jesus himself promised it. It's one of the most important verses that I love in the Gospels. In the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 12, before Jesus dies, one of the things he says to the disciples is, "The one who believes in me will also do the works that I do. And in fact, will do greater works than these." Right? The idea that those who followed Jesus wouldn't be bereft when Jesus was gone. They wouldn't be powerless when Jesus was gone. They wouldn't be stuck unable to do what they were able to do with their leader there. But it was his teaching that after Jesus was gone, they would do what he did. And they would do even greater things. Now, we can get amazed by the healing of a person. But what we also understand through the centuries is that what the disciples of Christ, what the followers of Christ have been able to do was not just heal a person or even just feed 5,000 persons, but rather the followers of Christ throughout history have healed so many, right? We look at all the hospitals that are named after church groups that started them. We look at all of the feeding programs that are done around the world by followers of Christ. And what we understand is that, in fact, we have done greater things. In fact, we have not just healed a few, we have healed millions. We have not just fed a few thousand, we have fed millions. And this is the followers of Christ doing what Jesus did in greater ways than when Jesus was here. But Peter does it by looking at what Jesus did. He's not thinking about what he taught. It says, for instance, he put them all aside and then he knelt down and prayed. Peter looks at this situation, which is just like the healing of Jairus' daughter, which I said Peter was a witness to, because when Jesus threw everyone else out of the house, he brought in just the girl's parents and his inner circle. Peter, James, and John were invited to see it. So Peter witnessed the performance of this miracle, and he stayed connected to it. He stayed connected to Jesus, and he stayed connected to Jesus through prayer, which was what he saw Jesus do so many times. Jesus would always take time away to pray and stay connected to God in that way. And so as you look at what Peter did and as you look at how this ran, one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is whether we're actually putting in the work to conform our lives to the pattern of Jesus. Are we simply trying to learn the concepts that Jesus taught? Are we simply trying to learn the teachings of Jesus? Or are we actually investing the time and the effort to conform our lives to his? To act and react to situations as he showed us how to do in the way he lived his everyday life. Right? It's not just about learning from him, it is about emulating him. It's about actually conforming our lives so that we are emulating Jesus, not just learning from Jesus. And sometimes we don't do that because we do remember appropriately that, hey, we're not Jesus. But we sometimes end up taking that attitude, hey, I'm not Jesus, to the point where we start discounting what God can actually do through us. See, so often we bifurcate the world, right? We focus on Jesus' teachings, and then we limit ourselves to doing what we think we can do. And yes, trying to align what we can do with what Jesus taught us to do. But when that happens, we're sometimes not actually expanding our understanding that what we can do is greater than what we thought when we have the power of God working through us. That when we are aligned with God, when we are actually connected with God in prayer, that the what of what we can do is actually expanded. It actually grows. And maybe we need to understand that we could do more because God is working through us. And that understanding is what will drive us to act. Yeah, I was away at a tech conference, at a church tech conference this week. Those are my people. Okay. So a church tech conference, hundreds of AV tech people around the country. It's really my folks. By the way, the hallmark of a church AV tech conference is when they're giving away complimentary Red Bull. Okay. That's it's like the official drink of tech people everywhere. Okay, and so they're giving away Red Bull. That was awesome. Right. But there was one of the speakers, a man named Todd Henry, who I've heard before. He wrote a really good book called The Accidental Creative. And he writes about creativity, and a big part of creativity is simply believing that you can, right? It's actually doing something. All right? Creativity, it's not just about what you're thinking, it's about actually taking what you're thinking, what you're dreaming, what you're visioning, and putting it into action, or else you've made nothing. All right? And so one of the things that he talked about, and I'm not going to talk about everything in his chart because that would just take us into repeating his talk. But there's one quadrant that he talked about, and he talked about two basic factors that lead to the courage to act. And they're pretty obvious, but they're important. And he said it's basically this, you can have pessimism or you can have optimism. All right? So you can either believe that outcomes are going to be bad or they're going to be good. All right, so you can be optimistic, you can be pessimistic. These are two columns you can have. And then the two rows that you have are either, in terms of your own role, you can perceive that you have agency. You can perceive that you have power, all right, to do something, or you can believe that you're powerless, all right? So, and these are perceptions, right, because you act based on your perceptions. So either you believe, you perceive that good outcomes are possible, or you don't, all right? And you can believe that you have the power to create outcomes, all right, that you have agency, or you can believe that you don't, all right? And if you are lacking either one, then you won't bother to try, you won't act. That the courage to act comes from both believing that you have the agency, the power to make something happen, and that you're optimistic and that what you can make happen is good, all right? If you're not optimistic, it becomes why bother, all right? If you think the outcome's going to be bad, it doesn't really matter whether you have agency or not. You're just not going to do anything, all right? And if you believe that you are powerless, even though you are optimistic, then you won't bother to try because you don't believe you have any power. And actually, that lower right quadrant, the perceived powerlessness, but optimism about an outcome, is often where Christians sit. And we sit there when we simply respond to a situation by praying about it, but not doing anything. See, because if you sit there and you're in that lower right quadrant, when you sit there and say, okay, I'm going to ask God to do it. And I'm going to be optimistic because I'm going to believe God can do something. But I'm not going to do anything because I don't believe I have any power. I don't believe I have any agency. Only God can do it. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to pray and I'm going to wait for God to do it. When in fact, we have both agency and optimism when we believe that God will prevail and that God is empowering us. You see, we should have both because we understand that God will prevail. Good prevails. Evil does not win. Good wins. God prevails. And so we should have optimism about what the outcome is going to be because God will not lose. But when it comes to agency, we also have to believe that we have agency because God is empowering us to act. God empowers us to act. We have agency. It's not simply a matter of sitting back and watching God and hoping that God is going to do something when in fact we're neglecting the extent to which God is empowering us and giving us agency with which to act. Relying on God does not relieve us of doing the work. Because when we're doing the work, understanding that we are empowered by God, we are still relying on God. We're just not turning it over completely to say, hey, God, you do it. I'm just going to watch you do it. Okay. I think I did that. I remember when I was a kid, I did that a couple times with a science fair project. You know, ever have a kid who does that, right? The parent ends up doing all the work. The kid just sort of watches and then takes the credit. All right? Sometimes I think we approach the world that way. We're gonna let God do the work. Okay. But it's not our job to just wait for God. And sometimes if we think it's not happening, it's because God is waiting for us. Right? God's waiting for us. Right? Yeah, we're asking God, and God's like, yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm ready to work through you. I'm ready to empower you. I'm ready to be right there with you. But you've got to actually do the work. All right? God's sitting there waiting for you. Right? God's like the perfect parent, right? The perfect parent doesn't do your project for you, but will resource you. Okay? The perfect parent will make sure you have the tools you need to do the project. Will guide you when you're doing the project, but you've actually got to do the work. God's working through us. And I wonder if we have the confidence to know that that question of what can we do is actually literally expanded by the power of God. That what we can do is greater because we are connected to God. That what we can do is not limited to what we could do before we had a relationship with God. And then we need to understand that it's not reserved for special situations. We so often are reading the Gospels, and it just seems like, okay, ordinary, miracle, ordinary, miracle, okay? And the power of God is not reserved just for those occasional, special situations that happen in life, but rather it's an everyday thing. That God is with us every day. God is working through us every day, and God is expecting us to conform ourselves to Jesus' life every day. I don't know how many of you have ever read this book, The Happiness Project by Gretchen Rubin. It was a New York Times bestseller, and so Google it. It's interesting. It's not religious. It's a secular work on happiness, but she wrote this, and one of the things that she said, which is really important, is this: what you do every day matters more than what you do once in a while. It's a very simple reminder. Now, she said that there were 3 things that you needed to do to be happy. So in the Happiness Project, she talks about 3 core ingredients to happiness. The first is pretty obvious, and so is the second. The first is feeling good. And you do that by doing more of what brings you good things in your life. Do more things that bring you joy. Do more things that bring you love. Do more things that bring you fun. Do more things that connect you with others. Do more things that are interesting to you. Do things that make you feel good. The second one's pretty obvious. Do less things that make you feel bad. Okay? All right? If it brings you anger, don't do it. All right? If it brings you guilt, don't do it. Okay? Don't do the things. I mean, so that's a pretty simple formula, right? I'm sure you've never thought of that before. If I want to be happier, I should do more things that bring me things that feel good and fewer things that make me feel bad. The third one is no less obvious when you think about it, but it's the one we often neglect. He said the third ingredient in being happy is to feel right. There's feeling good, there's feeling bad, and feeling right is living a life that reflects your values. Right? Okay. You have to do all 3. Because if you forget about feeling right, for example, feeling good can descend into hedonism, and there's no real happiness or joy at the end of the hedonistic path. All right. So feeling good and doing that which makes you feel good, avoiding that which makes you feel bad are both really important, but both have to be aligned with feeling right, with living a life that reflects your values. And these are things we need to do every single day. But when we know that God is at work through us, then we understand that we are empowered to live lives that reflect our values. And we can do that every day. And if we do that every day, it will matter more than those occasional bursts of good, those occasional bursts of help, those occasional miracles that can happen in our lives. Because what we want is lives that reflect our values and that will make us happier. But it's important that we do it every single day. Amen.